Here, on our channel, the stories of people from different eras come alive. People of different professions, different destinies. Each of them walks their own path. Each carries a life story woven from coincidence, hardship, and quiet, irreversible decisions. And before we fully step into their world, take a moment to subscribe. And later, if you wish, share your thoughts in the comments. And no, we continue. There are places on this earth where the very air is soaked with history, with salt, and with human sweat. Portsmouth, in November of 1867, was one such place. Fog rose above the Spithead Harbour as if the sea itself were breathing in its sleep. Through this milky veil, the silhouettes of ironclads slowly emerged, new iron monsters steadily replacing the wooden ships of a fading age. Thomas Blackwood opened his eyes at exactly 5 o'clock in the morning, as he had done for 12 years straight. His body knew the time before his mind did. Outside his second-floor room in Mrs. Pritchett's boarding house, darkness still ruled. But somewhere below, the first wagons were already rumbling, hauling coal toward the port warehouses. Cold. That was the first thing he felt. The fireplace in the corner had long since burned out, and during the night the room had chilled so deeply that his breath turned into a small cloud of steam. Thomas lay still for a while, pulling the thin blanket up to his chin, staring at the dark ceiling. Ewa, 34 years old. And every morning he woke up alone in this 8 by 10 foot room. 5 years had passed since cholera took Mary. Sometimes you is how to bed in Ugof dat. The day would not wait. He threw off the blanket in one decisive motion, easier that way than slowly, and sat on the edge of the narrow bed. The floorboards beneath his bare feet burned with cold. Tomawin said no sound. Behind the wall lived a dyer's family with 3 children. And he knew too well what it was like to wake from someone else's footsteps. Washing was brief and unpleasant. The water in the pitcher had formed a thin crust of ice overnight. Thomas cracked it with his finger, splashed his face, ran a wet hand over his short-cropped hair. In the dim mirror above the dresser, a face appeared he no longer truly examined. Weathered skin. Deep lines at the eyes from constant squinting, neatly trimmed sideburns. The face of a man who spent half his life underwater. Breakfast was simple, a piece of yesterday's bread and a mug of tea. Brewed on a small spirit stove, Mrs. Pritchett charged for shillings a week for the room. That price included neither food nor heating. Coal had to be bought separately, and Thomas used it sparingly, lighting the fireplace only in the evening when he returned from work. £3 a week. That was his wage as a dockyard diver. Very good money for a working man. Carpenters at the yard earned half as much, but a diver's work was worth every penny. It was dangerous, heavy, and demanded a particular kind of temperament. Not everyone could descend to the harbour floor in a copper helmet, knowing their life depended on a thin air hose and on the men above working the pump. Thomas finished his tea and began to dress. A wool shirt, a vest, heavy work trousers, boots with iron horseshoes. Then the overcoat, bought 3 years ago from a second-hand dealer on Lake Road, worn, but solid, good cloth. He hoped it would last another 5 years. £16, he thought, locking his door. Just 16, more pounds for a deposit on a small house in Fratton. £16. 5 or 6 weeks of work, if nothing went wrong. Then he could bring Alice home from his sister's place. His daughter was 11 now, nearly grown. She needed her father, not an uncle and aunt, no matter how kind they were. The staircase creaked beneath his steps. The ground floor smelled of sour cabbage and coal smoke. Mrs. Pritchett was already busy in the kitchen. Thomas nodded politely as he stepped outside. She replied with her usual grumble about the weather. Portsmouth was waking. King's Road at this hour was full of shadows. Workers hurried toward the shipyards. Market women pushed carts toward the square. Somewhere, a baby cried. Dogs barked at a passing carriage. Thomas followed his familiar route, one his feet knew by heart, past the Blue Anchor pub, past old Morris's rope shop, past the Methodist chapel with its soot-blackened facade. The fog began to thin. Ahead, masts appeared, a whole forest of masts. The entire Channel fleet lay at anchor in Spithead, and it seemed there were more wooden and iron giants than houses in the city. There is a particular beauty in a port city at dawn, something you cannot find anywhere else. The sea reeking of tar and rotten fish, the cries of gulls like the laments of restless souls, the clang of chains, the groan of rigging, and people, thousands of people, each knowing their place in the vast machine. Called the Royal Navy, Thomas had worked at the Naval Dockyard since the age of 22. He came here as a simple laborer after his father's death. His father had been a boatman. He drowned one winter night. No one ever learned how. The irony that the son chose a life underwater. Or perhaps it was a challenge. Thomas never thought about it too deeply. The main gates of the dockyard were guarded by Marines in red uniforms. Thomas showed his token and was waved through. Divers were known here by face. There were only 7 of them for the entire yard, and each was worth his weight in gold. Blackwood, a familiar voice called out. First again, damn you. Walter Finch stood by the workshop entrance where the diving gear was stored. He was 41 and had worked with Thomas for 8 years, first as an assistant, now as partner and pump operator. Broad-shouldered, his face traced with fine red veins from years of cold wind. Finch was a man Thomas trusted completely. When you are on the bottom and your life depends on the one pumping air above, trust ceases to be an abstract idea. It becomes as tangible as the air you breathe. Habit, Thomas replied, shaking his partner's hand. How are yours? The youngest is coughing. Finch shrugged. Meg says it's just a cold. But I worry. 6 children, he added quietly, and I still haven't gotten used to it. Take him to Dr. Harris on Commercial Road, Thomas said quietly. He doesn't charge much. Maybe I will, Finch replied. They stepped into the workshop, and Thomas was wrapped in a familiar scent, rubber, oxidized copper, and machine grease. This was where the diving gear was kept. 5 full sets for the entire dockyard. Heavy copper, Sieb helmets with 3 round glass ports. Rubberized suits. They kept water out, but let the cold seep in. 16-pound lead weights. And, most important of all, the hand-cranked air pump and the coils of signal line. Thomas approached his helmet and inspected it, as he did every morning. He ran a finger over the exhaust valve, checked the threading for tightness. It was a ritual, and rituals mattered. Once, a faulty valve, had cost a diver his life in Sheerness. Thomas had read about it in the newspaper, and since then he never skipped inspection. "What's the job today?" Finch asked, packing his pipe. "Hull inspection," Thomas replied. "Royal Arthur. They reported a leak in the hold yesterday. That old tub," Finch snorted. "I'm amazed. She's still floating." The Royal Arthur was a splivesliard Oudenol Tervis. It was no surprise the planking had begun to rot. Thomas would descend, inspect the underwater section, and report where repairs were needed. Routine. Simple routine. By 8 o'clock, everything was ready. Thomas stepped into the heavy suit. Two assistants helped fasten the lead weights. First on his chest, then on his back. Then the lead boots, sud-ouest Stevie. His legs barely moved in them. Finally, the helmet, and the world shrank to 3 round windows. Putting on a diving helmet was always strange. In un instant, you were cut off from Rithist. Your own breathing thundered in your ears. And you understood, completely, that your life now depended on the people outside, on those pumping the air, on those watching the signal line. Thomas took a deep breath and stepped to the edge of the pier. The descent, cold embraced him from all sides. November water was icy, even through the suit. But Thomas was used to it. Slowly, he descended into a greenish twilight. The surface world ceased to exist. Here, on the bottom of Spithead Harbour, there was another kingdom. Silty ground, covered in shells and debris. Seaweed swaying in the current like the hair of the drowned. Fish that showed no fear of the man in the copper helmet. And ships, vast, dark masses overhead, like the shadows of sleeping whales. Thomas worked methodically. Step by step, he examined the hull of the Royal Arthur, feeling the planks with thick-gloved hands. There, the damaged section. 3 planks were rotten. The caulking had failed. Seawater seeped into the hold. Not critical. But repairs were needed. Thomas tugged the signal line 3 times. The agreed signal, "Raise me." He felt the air hose tighten as Finch and the assistants began pulling him up. The job was done. That evening, Thomas sat in the Blue Anchor pub at his usual table by the window. A mug of porter stood before him, nearly untouched. He was thinking about the weekend. On Sunday, he would visit Alice. He should buy her something. A ribbon for her hair, or a book she loved to read. "Did you hear about Higgins?" someone asked at the neighboring table. Thomas listened without meaning to. Samuel Higgins was a diver too, worked the northern side of the yard. Went to stay with relatives in Liverpool, another voice replied. 3 weeks ago. His wife says he found a good place. Strange. Didn't say a word. Didn't even say goodbye. Happens, someone muttered. Something better comes along. Thomas frowned. He didn't know Higgins well, but well enough to be surprised. Samuel was a careful man, the kind who planned weeks ahead. Leaving without warning didn't sound like him. Still, what was it to Thomas? He finished his porter, paid, and stepped into the cold street. The walk home took 15 minutes. He used the time to count his savings. £23 in a tin box under the floorboards. 16 more, and he could put down a deposit. 5 weeks of work. He didn't know then that the next 5 weeks would change everything. November 15th was the kind of day after which life is divided into before and after. But that morning, Thomas Blackwood didn't know it yet. That morning, he woke to a knock at the door, insistent, demanding, the kind of knock that promised nothing good. Blackwood. The voice belonged to a yard messenger boy. Urgent call. Sir, Mr. Radcliffe requires you immediately, Thomas cursed softly, fumbling for matches in the dark. The clock on the dresser showed 4:15. Half an hour earlier than usual, urgent calls were rare, and they usually meant trouble. A ship aground, a broken anchor chain, some maritime disaster requiring immediate descent. 20 minutes later, he was walking toward the yard, wrapping his coat tighter against the cutting wind. The fog that morning was especially thick. A milky veil hid houses 10 steps away. Street lamps appeared as blurred yellow stains. Somewhere in the harbor, a siren wailed mournfully, likely the floating lighthouse at the entrance to the Solent. Superintendent Edward Radcliffe was waiting near the diving workshop. Ewa Tal, lean man of 50, with knee-trimmed, grey mustache and the bearing of a former naval officer. Radcliffe never raised his voice and rarely smiled. But the workers respected him, strict yet fair. He never demanded the impossible. Now, something like concern was written on his face. Blackwood, he nodded instead of greeting. You have a special assignment. Hull inspection, Radcliffe continued. Bellerophon, HMS Bellerophon was an ironclad, one of the Navy's new steel giants. Thomas had seen her on the roadstead. Black hull, massive funnel, Grande Turret. A beautiful ship, if such a word could be used for ships. A leak? Thomas asked. No, Radcliffe hesitated. Last night, the signalman noticed something unusual off the starboard side, some kind of object. Underwater, the captain demands an inspection before putting to sea. A strange phrasing. Some kind of object. It could have been anything. A torn net, a sunken boat, a barrel. Why the urgency? But Thomas didn't ask. In 12 years, he had learned not to pry. If command says dive, you dive. The rest is not your concern. Finch was already at the pump, bleary-eyed, grim. What's happened? He muttered, helping Thomas into the suit. We'll see. The rubber suit chilled the skin even through woolen underclothes. Thomas checked every connection as the assistants fastened the lead weights. The boots felt impossibly heavy, 20 pounds of metal each, but on the bottom they kept a diver grounded. The helmet went on last. The world narrowed again. The familiar rhythm of breathing returned. A launch delivered them to the Bellerophon in 20 minutes. The ironclad towered above the small boat like a mountain of metal. Even in the fog, she was imposing. Figures of sailors were visible on deck, keeping their distance. Starboard side, near the stern, the helmsman shouted, "That's where you look." Thomas nodded as much as one could inside a helmet and stepped overboard. The descent into November water was always a trial. The cold slowly seeped through the suit, stiffening his movements, making his heart beat a little faster, a little louder. But Thomas had learned, long ago, how to live with this feeling, how to accept it, how to let it pass through him without panic. He descended slowly, carefully watching the tension of the air hose as the greenish half-light wrapped around him from all sides, soft, heavy, almost velvety. The bottom of the harbor here was deeper than near the merchant piers, about 4 fathoms down. A flat, endless stretch of silt, covered with shells and broken fragments, spreading in every direction like a dull grey plain. Thomas touched down, feeling the lead solace sink gently into the soft ground, and paused, allowing his body to settle, allowing the water to grow quiet around him. The hull of the Bellerophon loomed to his right, a Avastan Darkonkold coating of algae. He moved along it slowly, running his gloved hands over the metal. Everything felt normal. No dents, no ruptures, no foreign objects. 20 feet. Then another 20, nothing, and then he saw it. At first, it seemed like a bundle of rags on the bottom, some shapeless mass tangled in silt, something the harbor had swallowed and forgotten. But as Thomas moved closer, the illusion dissolved. It was not rags. It was a man, a dead man, lying face up in a shallow bed of silt. His eyes were open, clouded now, staring into nothing. His face was pale, swollen by the water, but still unmistakably familiar. A stone was tied to his feet. An ordinary rock, about 20 pounds, secured tightly with rope, ante Samuel Higuin. A diver, a man who was supposed to have gone to Liverpool weeks ago. There are moments when the world stops, when time thickens like the water itself, and every second stretches into eternity. Thomas stood over the body of his former colleague, his heart pounding somewhere up in his throat. He had seen the dead before. Drownings happened several times a year in the harbor. But this was different. This was someone he knew. Someone everyone believed had simply left. The stone at the feet. This was no accident. This was murder. Thomas stumbled backward, his foot catching on something in the silt, nearly losing his balance. The air inside the helmet suddenly felt stale, thin, insufficient, even though the pump above was working perfectly. Panic pressed in. He yanked the signal line for times. Emergency ascent. The hose tightened. The ascent felt endless. When Thomas finally broke the surface and the helpers lifted the helmet from his shoulders, he stood there for a long moment, gasping cold air, the world around him blurred and unreal. What is it? Finch asked, staring at him. Tom, you're white as chalk. What happened? Thomas swallowed. A body, he said hoarsely. At the bottom, Higgins, Samuel Higgins. Silence fell. Even the sailors on the deck of the Bellerophon stopped talking. You're sure? Finch frowned. Higgins left. Tatorsim. And there's a stone tied to his feet. The next few hours blurred together into one long rush of noise and movement. Superintendent Redcliffe arrived. Then the harbor police. Then men in plain clothes, asking questions, writing answers. The body was brought up. That required another dive, this time with old Benjamin Cole, who went pale when he saw the corpse. Thomas was questioned 3 times. What did you see? How did you find it? Where exactly was the body? He answered mechanically, ove en ove, while a single thought circled endlessly in his mind. A stone on the feet. Someone killed him and threw him into the water. Around noon, when the chaos finally eased, a man approached Thomas, someone he had seen before, but didn't know well. Tall, pleasant face, neatly parted hair. A clerk, perhaps, a junior official. Henry Osborne, he said, extending his hand. Dockyard administration. A terrible incident, isn't it? Thomas shook his hand, feeling an odd unease. There was something in the man's eyes, a coldness behind the polite expression. "Did you know the deceased well?" Osborne asked gently. "Not closely. We work different sections." "I see." "I see," Osborne nodded. "And did he ever mention anything to you?" "Plans to leave. Any troubles?" A strange question. Thomas frowned. "I last spoke to him about a month ago. Nothing unusual. Just work. And about fines on the bottom." Osborne added lightly, "Did Higgins ever discover anything unusual during his dives?" "Fines on the bottom? What did that have to do with this?" "We all find things," Thomas said cautiously. "Debris, lost tools. It's a harbor. There's all kinds of stuff down there. Of course." "Of course." Osborne smiled, but the smile never reached his eyes. "I was just curious." "A dreadful business with Higgins. Let's hope the police sort it out quickly." He patted Thomas on the shoulder and walked away, leaving behind a faint, lingering sense of unease. That evening, Thomas and Finch sat at their usual table in the Blue Anchor. The pub was crowded. News of the body had spread through the yard, and people had gathered to talk. "So he never went to Liverpool," Finch said quietly, sipping his beer. "All those weeks. Lying on the bottom. Someone killed him," Thomas replied. "The stone. He wouldn't have tied it himself." Finch grimaced. "Could be a gambling debt. Or some woman's trouble. You know how it goes. Higgins didn't gamble. And he had a wife. So it's something else." Finch leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Listen, Tom, as a friend, don't get involved. A man was killed, yes. But that's what the police are for. We're just workers. We don't need trouble." Thomas stared into his mug. Finch was right. Of course he was. He had his own life. His daughter, a house he was saving for. Why get tangled in something that wasn't his concern? And yet, Osborne's questions echoed in his mind. The lie about Liverpool, who started it, and why? Why make everyone believe Higgins had left when he was lying at the bottom of the harbor? "Do you hear me, Tom?" Finch said softly, "Forget. Drink your beer. Go home. Sil porto mano dead." But he knew he wouldn't forget. Some things cannot be forgotten, no matter how hard you try. Higgins' face, his open, dead eyes, would come back in dreams. He felt it already. Management usually turned a blind eye to such things. Small fines, coins, scraps. But what if Higgins had found something more? Something valuable enough, dangerous enough, to kill for? Thomas shook his head, trying to push the thought away. Finch was right. This was not his business. He finished his tea, undressed, and lay down. The blanket was thin, but the fireplace had already begun to warm the room. Outside, the wind howled, and somewhere far away a ship's horn groaned, long and lonely. Sleep did not come at once, and when it finally did, it brought the harbor floor with it, Higgins' dead eyes, the stone tied to his feet. En Davois, a quiet, insistent voice, repeating again and again, "He didn't go anywhere. He didn't go." Thomas woke in the middle of the night because of that voice and lay in the darkness for a long time, staring at the ceiling. He knew then that he would not be able to leave this alone. He simply couldn't. The official conclusion arrived 3 days later. A constable read it aloud at the dockyard, before a gathered crowd of workers. Samuel Higgins, as a reservant. Presumably, while returning home, In a state of alcohol intoxication, he fell from the pier and drowned. The stone attached to his legs likely became entangled. During the fall in a fishing net with a weight, Thomas listened and could not believe his ears. A fishing net. Higgins lived 2 miles from the nearest fishing pier, and the stone was not tied with a net, but with ordinary hemp rope. Thomas had seen it himself, underwater, by the dim light filtering through the helmet's glass. A sailor's knot, strong, skillful. A knot like that does not happen by accident. But who would listen to a diver? The workers dispersed, talking quietly among themselves. Most accepted the official version without question. People find it easier to believe in accidents than in murder. Murder means that a killer is walking nearby. And who wants to live with that thought? Finch caught up with Thomas near the workshop. "Well," he said with obvious relief, "there you go. They figured it out. Un accident, just like Oliver Msesach vegetated. And what difference does it make what I believe? The police have spoken. The case is closed. Period. The stone on his feet. Walter. A net with a weight. You heard it." Thomas wanted to argue, but stopped. There was something in Finch's eyes. Not fear, a warning. "Don't continue. For your own good." "All right," Thomas said quietly, turning away. "I'll get back to work." The day passed in familiar routine. 2 dives to inspect pier pilings, a cold lunch, another dive. His hands did their usual work, while his mind was far away. By evening, Thomas had made a decision. On Sunday, he planned to visit his daughter. Nancy and her husband lived in Southsea, half an hour's walk from the port. And little Alice always waited eagerly for his visits. But on the way there, Thomas decided to make a detour. Higgins' widow, Martha, lived on Hope Street in a small house of soot-darkened brick. Thomas knocked on the door around 10 in the morning, wondering what he could possibly say. "Hello, Mrs. Higgins. I found your husband dead at the bottom of the harbor. And I don't believe it was an accident. Madness. The door was not opened by Martha. A young woman stood on the threshold, about 27, with a tired face and reddened eyes. Dark hair gathered into a careless knot. Her hands were covered in soap suds. How can I help you?" "I'm looking, Mrs. for Mrs. Sagan's capto mablakud." "Dockyard diver," the woman flinched. "You're the one who found Samuel." "Yes." She studied him for a long moment, then stepped aside. "Come in. Martha is upstairs, but she hesitated. She's not able to talk. The doctor gave her laudanum, but I can answer your questions if you like." "I'm Molly Davis, Martha's sister." Davis. The name sounded familiar. Inside, the house was poor but clean. Molly led him into a tiny sitting room where a small iron stove was burning and gestured to a chair. "Forgive the mess. I'm helping my sister while she's unwell. I understand." Thomas sat down, still holding his cap. "Mrs. Davis. Your husband wouldn't happen to be James Davis, a diver?" Molly froze. "You knew James. We worked at the same yard. He died about a year ago, didn't he?" 13 months, Molly said quietly, sitting opposite him. "An accident during a dive. The air hose broke. It happened sometimes. Rarely, hoses were checked before every dive." Thomas remembered that case. They talked about it for a week at the yard, then forgot. One diver died. Another was hired, life went on. But now, after Higgins, it looked different. "Mrs. Davis," Thomas said carefully, "I want to ask you something. It may sound strange, but before his death, did your husband say anything unusual? Was he worried? Did he mention problems at work?" Molly looked up at him. There was pain in her eyes, old pain, settled pain. The kind one learns to live with. "Why do you ask?" "Because I don't believe Higgins' death was an accident," Thomas said softly. "And I'm beginning to doubt your husband's was either." Silence. Outside, a coal vendor shouted his wares. Molly slowly clasped her hands on her knees. "James was frightened," she said at last, "the last 2 weeks before his death. He slept badly, jumped at every sound. I asked him, but he wouldn't explain, only once. He let something slip." "What did he say?" "About fines on the bottom." Molly lowered her voice. "He said he'd found something he was never meant to find, and that he didn't know what to do. Fines on the bottom. Again, Osborne had asked the same thing. Did he say what it was?" "No, but I remember his words exactly." She swallowed. "It's big money, Molly, very big money. And there are big people behind it." A chill ran down Thomas' spine. Big people. That could mean anyone, officers, officials, even someone from the Admiralty. "After his death," Molly continued, "I found a notebook among his things. I thought it might be important, but I couldn't make sense of it. Just numbers, notes. I gave it to the police. They returned it. Said it wasn't relevant." "Do you still have it?" Thomas asked. "Molly nodded." She stood, left the room, and returned a minute later with a small, worn notebook bound in cracked leather. She handed it to him. "Take it. Maybe you'll understand it." "It only tears at my heart." Thomas opened the notebook. The pages were filled with small handwriting, dates, numbers, brief notes. November 14th, West Pier, 3 fathoms, 20 yards from pile number 7, Dissequenea Victoria, the stern. Page after page, coordinates. James Davis had been recording locations on the harbor floor. "Thank you," Thomas said, slipping the notebook into the inner pocket of his coat. "I'll try to figure it out." "Be careful, Mr. Blackwood," Molly said seriously. James tried to figure it out too. And Samuel, I suppose. Look how that ended, all the way to his sister's house. Thomas thought about the notebook burning against his chest through the fabric, or perhaps it only felt that way. Dive coordinates that did not match official assignments. To dead divers in 13 months. And a question, growing louder, in the quiet. Who could you trust when your life was in someone else's hands? There were too many coincidences for this to be an accident. Nancy met him at the doorstep, as always, with hugs and gentle scolding. "You've lost weight, and those dark circles under your eyes. You're not sleeping again. Work," Thomas lied quietly. "There's been a lot of work." "There's always a lot of work with you," she said, stepping aside. "Come in. Alice has been restless all morning, waiting for you." His daughter ran out from the back of the house, slender, fair-haired, with the eyes of her late mother, Mary, 11 years old, no longer a child, not yet a young woman. That awkward age when you want to be grown up but don't yet know how. "Baba?" Thomas lifted her, held her close. Alice smelled of soap and freshly baked bread, warm, homely scent so painfully absent from his lonely, rented room. "I brought you something." He pulled a ribbon from his pocket, blue, Silk, bought from a street vendor on the way. Alice gasped with delight. Real silk, Papa. That must be expensive, not for you. Lunch passed in small talk. Josh, Nancy's husband, spoke about a new order, a wardrobe for a merchant on High Street. Nancy complained about shop prices. Alice showed her drawings. She drew well for her age. Thomas listened, smiled, replied, and all the while thought about the notebook. After lunch, when Alice ran off to play with the neighbor's children, Nancy settled her brother into an armchair by the fireplace. "Now tell me," she said in a tone that allowed no argument. "What's happened? How do you know something happened?" "I've known you for 30 years, Thomas Blackwood." "You weren't here all through lunch," Thomas sighed. There was no point hiding anything from Nancy. She always saw straight through him. "I found a body in the harbor last week. A diver from the dockyard. We worked together." Nancy went pale. "My God." "What does the police say?" "An accident," Thomas said, grimacing. "But I don't believe it. There are too many strange details." "Thomas," Nancy leaned closer. "You're not planning to get involved in this, are you?" "No." She grabbed his hand. "Listen, Thomas. You have a daughter. She waits for you every week. If something happens to you, nothing will happen. You don't know that." Tears rang in her voice. "Father drowned. Mary died. If you too, Tom. I won't survive it. And Alice won't either." Thomas covered her hand with his own. "I'll be careful," he said softly. But even as he spoke, he knew he would not stop. He couldn't. 2 men were dead, and someone had to find the truth. If not him, then who? That evening, back in his room, Thomas sat at the table, laid out James Davis's notebook, and lit a candle. There was no gas lighting in the lodging house. He began to study the entries. Dive coordinates. Some matched official assignments. Others did not. West Pier, North Mole, an area near the old warehouse. Places where divers had no reason to be. Thomas took out his harbor map, the one he used for work, and began marking points. 1, 2, 5, 10 by midnight. A dozen circles lay scattered across the water. What had Davis been looking for there? Or not looking for, but finding? Big money, Molly, very big. The word came to him on its own, smuggling, and suddenly everything made sense. Thousands of tons of cargo passed through the port, official and unofficial. What if someone was using the harbor floor as a hiding place, dropping goods at specific points, then raising them later with the help of divers who thought they were doing ordinary work? Then Davis discovered it, and he was killed. And then the same happened to Higgins. Thomas leaned back in his chair. His hands trembled slightly. Finch, the thought struck like a blow. Finch had warned him twice. "Don't get involved," he said. "You'll be safer." At the time, it sounded like friendly advice. But what if it wasn't? Thomas shook his head. Finch was his partner. They'd worked together 8 years. 12, if you counted the time Finch had been an assistant. This was the man he trusted with his life every time he descended into the water. To suspect him was madness, and yet the doubt did not go away. Thomas hid the notebook under the floorboard next to the tin box with his savings, blew out the candle, lay down on the cold bed, and stared into the darkness, listening to the wind howl outside. Moreau. He would speak to Constable O'Brien. Patrick O'Brien was a port policeman, an honest Irishman who had served in the harbour for 15 years. If anyone knew the harbour's secrets, it was him. For now, sleep. Tomorrow would be a hard day, but sleep did not come. Each time, Thomas closed his eyes, he sullen pale, with the day. The stone tied to his feet, and the air hose. That could snap at any moment. At any moment. Constable Patrick O'Brien was found, as usual, in the guard hut by the north gate of the dockyard. A small wooden structure with an iron stove inside, serving as both checkpoint and a place for port police to warm themselves between patrols. O'Brien was a large man of 45, with a weathered face and thick, reddish mustaches. That he stroked whenever he thought. 20 years earlier, he had come from Cork, fleeing famine, and had served Her Majesty faithfully ever since, first in the army, then in port police. The workers respected him because he took no bribes and never looked down on the poor. Thomas waited until the end of the workday. November 23rd had been especially long, 3 dives in a row. He walked to the guard hut. His legs ached with fatigue, but his mind was clear. Mr. Blackwood. O'Brien looked up from his mug of tea. What can I do for you? A conversation. Constable. If you have time. The Irishman studied him, then nodded toward a stool by the stove. Sit down. Tea? I won't refuse. The hot tea in a tin mug warmed his hands. Thomas was silent for a moment, gathering his thoughts. How do I begin? I think divers are being murdered at the dockyard. It sounded insane. You didn't come just to warm yourself, O'Brien said calmly. I'm listening. Thomas decided to start from afar. Do you remember James Davis, the diver who died 13 months ago? O'Brien frowned. Either. The air hose broke during a dive. A bad business. And Samuel Higgins, the one I found. O'Brien set his mug aside. What are you getting at, Mr. Blackwood? At the fact that 2 divers in 13 months is too many. And both died under strange circumstances. Both officially ruled accidents. I know Thomas hesitated, but Higgins had a stone tied to his feet, with a sailor's knot. I saw it myself. O'Brien was silent for a long time. Then he stood, looked out. Satisfied no one was nearby, he returned. I don't believe it was an accident either, he said quietly. But there are things a simple constable is not meant to know, and certainly not meant to say aloud. What things? Smuggling. O'Brien said the word almost in a whisper. More goods pass through this dockyard than the records show. Copper, rope, tools, anything that can be sold. I've noticed oddities for years. Every time I tried to dig deeper, I was stopped. By whom? O'Brien spread his hands. Orders from above. Don't get involved. A matter of state importance, they say. What kind of state matter? No one explains. And I'm a small man. I still need to live long enough to reach my pension. Thomas took Davis's notebook from his pocket. Look at this. O'Brien took the notebook, flipped through several pages. His eyebrows slowly rose. Coordinates, dive locations. Some match official assignments, but most do not. I believe the divers were used to retrieve contraband, Thomas said quietly. They didn't know what they were doing. They were just following orders, and when they realized, they were removed. The constable returned the notebook and again stroked his mustache. A dangerous theory, Mr. Blackwood. Very dangerous. If you're right, you're dealing with serious people. The kind who don't leave witnesses, I understand. No, you don't. O'Brien leaned closer. Listen to the advice of an old serviceman. Forget this. Burn the notebook. Live your life. You have a daughter, as far as I know. Think about her. You won't help the dead, but you will destroy yourself. Thomas finished his tea and stood. Thank you for the conversation. Constable, wait. O'Brien stood as well. If you do decide to dig deeper, be careful. If you find something concrete, come to me. I won't promise miracles, but I'll do what I can. They shook hands. Et toi, film, honest Heinches shared Ben, who understand each other without unnecessary words. For the next 4 days, Thomas studied the notebook every evening, matching coordinates with the harbor map. Gradually, the picture became clearer. Most of the marked points lay away from common routes, places where boats rarely passed. Where the depth was enough to hide cargo from accidental eyes, one point caught his attention. It appeared several times at intervals of 2 to 3 weeks. Next to each date was the same mark, ML initials Thomas did not recognize, but instinct told him. This place mattered. On November 27th, the first snow fell. Not true winter snow, just a light powder, melting as soon as it touched the ground. But the cold deepened. Thomas began spending more coal on heating. Every extra shilling pushed the dream of his own house further away. That day, he made a decision. After work, when most laborers had already gone home, Thomas stayed behind in the workshop under the pretense of checking equipment. Finch left earlier, complaining about his youngest son, who still had a cough. The assistants disappeared as well. Thomas was alone. He put on the diving suit himself, heavy, awkward, but possible. He fastened the weights clumsily. The helmet went on last. There was no one to work the pump, but Thomas knew a trick. If the dive was shallow enough, the air inside the helmet would last 10 to 15 minutes. Risky, but doable. The point he chose lay near the old pier by the northern warehouse. Depth, about 2 fathoms, according to Davis's notes. The bottom was muddy, the current weak, a perfect hiding place. Thomas climbed down the rope ladder fixed to the pier and slipped into the black water. The November cold wrapped around him instantly, seeping through the rubberized fabric. Without a steady air supply, each breath felt heavier than the last. Below, it was dark. The sun was already setting, and only dim reflections reached the water. Thomas moved by touch, hands searching the silty bottom, shells, wood fragments, some cloth. And then something solid, metal, wrapped in oil-soaked canvas. He pulled. The weight gave way surprisingly easily. It lay shallow, covered by only a thin layer of silt. Thomas dragged the bundle free and surfaced, gasping desperately for air. On the pier, he sat for a long time, gulping cold air until his heart slowed. Then he unwrapped the canvas. Inside were 3 copper sheets, standard size, stamped with the Admiralty seal. Thousands of such sheets were stored at the dockyard. They were used to sheath ship hulls to prevent fouling. Each sheet was worth about 10 shillings. Altogether, the bundle held copper worth £0.5, trifling by dockyard standards. But if there were hundreds of such bundles, Thomas sat on the pier, staring at the copper, feeling the puzzle pieces slide into place. The scheme was simple, elegant. Someone was stealing government property, copper, rope, tools, and dropping it at designated points in the harbor. Later, during official dives, divers were accidentally sent to these locations. They found the lost property, returned it to management, and received the standard reward. The property was written off, sold quietly, and the difference settled into someone's pockets. A perfect crime. No traces, no evidence. The divers thought they were simply lucky. Management received reports of recovered goods, and the real thieves grew rich. But James Davis noticed something. He began keeping records, dates, places. And he was killed. Then Higgins. Perhaps he understood too. And he was killed as well. Thomas hid the copper sheets back underwater. No need to attract attention. He changed clothes, stowed the equipment, and walked home slowly. Along the way, he thought about who to tell. O'Brien had warned him, powerful people, but who exactly? Dockyard superiors? Someone in the Admiralty, or common thieves who had bribed the right officials. One name kept circling his thoughts. Henri Osborne, a clerk with a pleasant face who always asked questions about fines from the bottom. Did he know about the scheme, or was he part of it? That evening, Thomas told Finch everything. It was a mistake. He realized it later. But at that moment, he needed someone to trust. Someone to listen, to advise. To help the friend au sud-ouest, Titsi Med. They sat at the Blue Anchor, at a table far from prying ears. Thomas spoke quietly, almost in a whisper. Finch listened, his face unreadable. Smuggling, he summarized when Thomas finished. And you think Davis and Higgins died because they found out? I don't think, Thomas said. I'm certain. Finch was silent for a long time, turning an empty mug in his hands. Do you understand what you're getting into? He asked finally. If you're right, this is about big money. And people who kill for it, understand? And you? Toma no dead to mena, Walter. I can't just forget, Finch sighed. All right. If you're set on this, at least be careful. Don't go alone. Don't take unnecessary risks. If you need help, say the word. I'm with you. Thank you. They shook hands. The grip was firm, as always, the handshake of partners who trust each other with their lives. That night, lying in his cold bed, Thomas dreamed again. He stood on the harbor floor, encased in the heavy diving suit. Suddenly, he realized the air had stopped. The hose had snapped. The pump was silent. He pulled the signal line. Once, twice, a third time. No answer. And in that dead silence, in the greenish half-light, he heard a voice, and who's holding the pump? Tom, who's holding the pump? He woke in a cold sweat. Outside, a gray dawn was breaking. November 28th. 3 days remained. 3 days before everything would change. The first real snow fell on Portsmouth on the night of December 1st. Not a dusting. Not scattered flakes. But a dense white blanket covering streets, rooftops, and the masts of ships in the harbor. By morning, the city had transformed. Mud and soot vanished beneath clean, untouched snow, and even the smoke-blackened facades of the tenement houses looked almost festive. Thomas stood by the window of his room, watching the first passers-by carve narrow paths through the fresh snow. Beautiful, Mary loved snow. She used to say it made the world more honest, because it hid everything ugly. Back then, Thomas laughed and replied, that snow was simply cold and wet. Now, 5 years later, he understood what she meant. But there was no time to admire it. The morning cold seeped through the cracks in the window frame, a quiet reminder that it was time to dress and go to work. The summons to Superintendent Redcliffe came at 9 o'clock sharp. As Thomas walked through the dockyard, he felt eyes on him. After the Higgins incident, even those who had once ignored him now seemed to recognize him, the diver who found the body. A kind of notoriety he would gladly have lived without. Redcliffe's office was located in the administrative building, a two-story red brick structure where clerks and dockyard officials worked. Thomas rarely came here, only when something important and usually unpleasant was involved. Redcliffe waited behind a massive desk buried beneath paperwork. At 52, the superintendent had retained his military posture and his habit of speaking briefly, directly, without embellishment. His sideburns and mustache were, as always, impeccably trimmed, his uniform buttoned to the collar. But today there was something unfamiliar in his eyes, concern, warning. "Sit down, Blackwood." Thomas sat on the hard chair opposite the desk. Redcliffe shuffled papers for a moment, or pretended to. "I've been informed," he said finally, "that you've been asking questions about Higgins, about Davis, about findings on the harbor floor." Thomas said nothing. Silence, at times, spoke more clearly than words. "You are a good worker, Blackwood." Redcliffe raised his eyes. 12 years of flawless service. Not a single complaint. Your colleagues respect you. Management values you. A pause. Outside, a seagull cried, sharp, mournful, cutting through the air. "But there are things better left unknown." Redcliffe lowered his voice. "Things one should not interfere with. Do you understand what I'm saying?" "I'm not sure, sir." "Then I'll be clear." Redcliffe leaned forward. "Stop asking questions. Forget Higgins. Forget Davis. Do your job and stay out of other people's affairs. And if I ask why, don't." The superintendent's gaze hardened. "You have a daughter, Blackwood. Think of her." A chill ran down Thomas's spine. "Et toi très coléré, unmistakable." Redcliffe, whom Thomas had always considered a fair man, had just invoked his daughter, in a way that left no doubt. "I understand, sir. I hope so." Redcliffe leaned back. "You're dismissed." Thomas left the office with a heavy heart. In the corridor, he nearly collided with Henry Osborne. The clerk emerged from a neighboring door, a folder tucked under his arm. "Mr. Blackwood." Osborne smiled his unpleasant smile. "What a coincidence." "I was just looking for you." "Why?" "Totalk." Osborne glanced around and lowered his voice. "No air." "This evening, the Three Crowns on High Street." Thomas wanted to refuse, but something made him nod. An enemy who wants to talk is an enemy who might slip. The day passed in work. To Dives to inspect pier pilings. Routine. Finch worked the pump as usual. Steady, reliable. And yet, Thomas caught himself feeling something strange. Each time he descended, he thought about the air hose, how easily it could be cut. About the simple fact that his life depended on the man above. After all, he didn't go home. Instead, he headed to the northern pier, the spot where he had dived alone 2 days earlier. Juste to check whether the copper sheets were still there. They were gone. Thomas stood on the pier, staring into the black water. Someone had watched him. Someone had seen the dive. Someone had removed the evidence. Finch, he had told Finch about the discovery, no one else. Thomas shook his head. Impossible. Finch was a friend. Appartenait. 8 years together. There had to be another explanation. There had to be. He arrived at the 3 Crowns exactly at 8. The pub was respectable, nothing like the Blue Anchor with its smoke-stained walls and wobbling tables. Here gathered clerks, small merchants, people with means. Osborne waited at a corner table. A bottle of port stood before him, 2 glasses. "I'm glad you came." He gestured to the chair. "Sit, have a drink." Thomas sat, but did not touch the glass. "What did you want to talk about?" "Straight to the point." Osborne smirked. "Good. I appreciate directness." He poured himself port, took a sip, then spoke quietly, confidentially, like an old acquaintance. "You're a smart man, Blackwood. Smarter than most dockyard workers, and you've learned something. Something inconvenient. Go on. You see," Osborne continued, "there are people who don't like your questions. Serious people. People who can make life very unpleasant." He set the glass down. "But I'm not one of them. I'm a mediator. They sent me with an offer." "What kind?" "A simple one." Osborne took an envelope from his pocket and placed it on the table. £20, more than you earn in a month and a half. Take it. And for Geese fines on the buys. Leave your life to Poon. Exactly the amount he lacked for the house deposit. Exactly the amount, as if someone knew. Thomas stared at the envelope. Inside him, 2 men fought. One, practical, cautious, whispered, "Take the money. Think of your daughter. You can't help the dead." The other, stubborn, unyielding, said, "They killed 2 men. If you take this, you become an accomplice, and if I refuse..." Osborne sighed, like a man forced to deliver unpleasant news. Then he spread his hands. "I can't guarantee your safety. Accidents happen, Mr. Blackwood, especially to divers. A hose can tear. A pump can fail. A signal line can tangle. You know that. This is not a threat," Osborne said calmly. "It's a statement of fact." He stood. "Think about it until tomorrow. If you decide to accept, just take the envelope and place it in your inner pocket. If not, well, I've done all I can." He nodded and left, leaving Thomas alone with the envelope on the table. Thomas sat in the pub for another hour. He drank tea, ordered instead of port, and thought, £20. A small house in Fratton, Alice living with him, not with her aunt and uncle. A normal life for 5 years, and all it required was forgetting to dead men. Stood, left money for the tea, and walked outside. The envelope remained on the table. The next 3 days passed in anxious waiting. Thomas worked as usual, but each dive became an ordeal. Descending, he thought about the air stopping at any moment. Ascending, he checked the hose for cuts. Paranoia, perhaps, but paranoids were alive. Higgins and Davis were not. On December 4th, what he feared finally happened. The dive was routine, inspection of the transport vessel Mercury. Depth 3 fathoms, visibility decent for December. Thomas worked methodically, examining the hull, marking areas needing repair, and then he felt it. The air changed. It didn't stop completely, but the air began to come in weaker, in short, uneven pulses, a familiar sensation, one that, meant only one thing: a problem with the hose. Thomas tugged the signal line 3 times. Emergency ascent. The response came immediately. The line tightened, and he was pulled upward. But the air grew thinner with every breath. When he broke the surface, the first thing he saw was Finch's face, pale, alarmed. "Tom, thank God. What happened?" "The hose," Thomas rasped, tearing off the helmet. "Something's wrong with the hose." The assistants were already examining the equipment. A minute later, one of them, a young lad named Eddie, looked up. "Here, look, a cut." A neat, diagonal cut in the air hose, about 10 feet from the helmet. Not all the way through, otherwise Thomas would already be dead, but deep enough to disrupt the airflow. How could this happen? Finch took the hose, studying the damage. "I checked it before the dive. It was fine, which means someone cut it after," Thomas said. Silence fell. Everyone understood what that meant. "We need to report this to Redcliffe," Eddie said. "No," Thomas shook his head. "No, we don't." Finch looked at him, confused. "Why?" "Because it won't change anything." Thomas stood, his knees trembling. "They'll blame wear and tear, or my negligence. No one will look for whoever did it." That evening, sitting alone in his room, Thomas stared at the damaged hose. He had taken it with him, against regulations, evidence, the only proof that someone had tried to kill him. Who could have gotten close to the equipment between inspection and the dive? Finch had been nearby the whole time. So had the assistants, an outsider? But the upper docks were guarded. No strangers were allowed near diving gear. Unless the stranger wasn't really a stranger. Thomas remembered Osborne's words. Accidents happen. This was the accident that didn't happen, only because the cut hadn't been deep enough. A mistake, or a warning, the last warning before a real attempt. Erster Akt. Gather evidence. Find witnesses. Turn to someone who could help, but to whom? O'Brien had warned him about powerful people. Redcliffe had threatened him. Osborne had offered money for silence. The entire system worked against him. Only Finch remained. "If you need help," Finch had said, "I'm with you." Thomas took out Davis's notebook and made a copy. He rewrote all the coordinates and notes onto a separate sheet of paper. The original he hid beneath the loose floorboard. The copy he slipped into his pocket. If something happened to him, at least the copy would survive. Then he wrote a short letter to O'Brien, laying out everything he knew, the coordinates, the smuggling scheme, his suspicions about the murders. He sealed the letter and placed it in his pocket beside the copy. Tomorrow he would give it to the constable, and then they would see. As he drifted towards sleep, Thomas thought of Alice, her blue eyes, so much like Mary's, the way she laughed, trying on the blue ribbon. The little house on Fratton Road that might remain nothing more than a dream. "Forgive me, little one," he thought. "Forgive me for not being able to simply forget." Outside the window, snow continued to fall, quietly, steadily, covering the city with a white blanket. Mary loved snow. She said it made the world more honest. Maybe she was right. Constable O'Brien disappeared on December 7th. Thomas learned about it by chance from old Morris, the owner of a small kiosk who heard everything that happened around the port. Transferred somewhere north. Maurice, why not already cleaned? Newcastle or Sunderland? Not sure. Promotion, they say. Promotion. Thomas stood in the shop, feeling the ground slip away beneath him. A sudden transfer of an honest policeman who asked inconvenient questions. How convenient. The letter to O'Brien was still in his pocket. Now there was no one to give it to. The system protected its own. Everyone who tried to get close to the truth disappeared, one way or another. Davis and Higgins were gone forever. O'Brien had simply been removed from the path. Who was next? The question was rhetorical. Thomas already knew the answer. That same evening, he went to Southsea without warning, without a reason. He just wanted to see his daughter. Nancy was surprised by his weekday visit, but let him in without questions. She always understood him better than he understood himself. Alice sat by the fireplace, reading a worn copy of Oliver Twist, the book Thomas had given her last Christmas. When she saw him, she jumped up and ran into his arms. "Papa, why are you here today?" "I just missed you, Eugédère," breathing in the familiar scent of soap and bread, 11 years old. Almost a grown, and still his little girl. His only link to Mary, to the life that had been, to hope for the future. If something happens to me, he thought, she be an orphan. Nancy her, butid will not böse sam. "Papa, you're acting strange." Alice looked up at him. "Did something happen?" "No, sweetheart. Everything's fine." The lie came too easily. Thomas realized he had learned to lie over the past few weeks. Lie to Finch, lie to his superiors, lie to his daughter. Lies had become part of daily life, like the cold outside the window. After dinner, when Alice went to bed, Nancy sat him down by the fire and poured tea. "Talk," she said, "and tell me the truth. I'm not blind, Thomas. You came without warning." You look at Alice like you're saying goodbye. What's going on? He wanted to wave it off, invent another lie, but he was tired of carrying it alone. "I've gotten involved in something serious," he said at last. "Bad things are happening at the dockyard. People are dying." And then a shadow appeared in the doorway, outlined by the light of a lantern held in a hand. The face was impassive, no surprise, no anger. "I knew you'd come," Finch said quietly. "Sooner or later, Walter." Thomas stepped back. "What are you doing here?" "The same thing as you." Finch entered, closing the door behind him. "Looking for the truth. Only I've been looking longer." Thomas stared at him, confused. "I've been watching Osborne for several months," Finch continued, "waiting for the right moment. And then you showed up with your questions and complicated everything. You knew about the smuggling." "I did." Finch set the lantern on the table. "And I knew who was behind it. Osborne, Redcliffe, and a few others from the Admiralty. It's a big scheme, Tom. Very big. Why didn't you say anything?" "Because without proof, it's just words." Finch nodded toward the notebook hidden under Thomas's coat. "And now we have proof. We." The word sounded like a lifeline. Thomas wasn't alone. Finch was on his side. Altice team is starting his own investigation. He simply didn't want to drag Thomas into it. "We need to leave. The patrol will be back soon. We'll talk somewhere safe." They slipped out through the back door and dissolved into the darkness. Snow began to fall again. Large flakes spun slowly in the glow of rare street lamps. Thomas followed Finch, feeling a strange mix of relief and unease. "Where are we going?" Thomas asked quietly. "To the North Pier," Finch replied. "No one will find us there." The North Pier, the place where Thomas had once dived alone, where he had found the copper sheets, the place marked in Davis's notebook. They walked in silence. The dockyard at night felt like another world, dark, hollow, filled with shadows and unfamiliar sounds. Somewhere, masts creaked, chains chimed softly. Water lapped against the pilings, slow and patient. At the pier, Finch stopped and turned to Thomas. "There's something I need to tell you," he said quietly. "About tomorrow." He spoke of Osborne's plan, a major operation. The final shipment of contraband before Christmas. Everything would be hidden in one place, beneath the old warehouse at the Eastern Mole, tomorrow morning. "And what do you suggest?" Thomas asked. "We dive during the operation. Catch them in the act." Thomas thought it over. The plan was bold and dangerous. "What if we're caught?" "We won't be." Finch placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "I'll cover you from above. I'll run the pump, watch the signals, like always, like always." For 8 years, Finch had pumped air while Thomas worked below. For 8 years, his life had depended on this man. And not once, not a single time, had Finch failed him. "All right," Thomas said. In the darkness, they shook hands. Itois firme, confident, handshake. The handshake of partners who trust each other with their lives. Thomas returned home around midnight. He lay down in the cold bed, but sleep did not come quickly. Osborne's notebook rested beneath his pillow, solid, reassuring, like a promise of justice. Tomorrow, everything would end. Tomorrow, they would expose the criminals. The truth would surface. On Mebten Hieslen peace. For the first time in many weeks, Thomas felt something close to hope. He did not know that this would be the last calm night of his life. December 13th, 1867 began with fog, thick, dense, milky white, so heavy that after 3 steps nothing could be seen. Thomas woke long before dawn, though dawn itself was not expected. On days like this, the sun did not break through until noon. He lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, listening to the city awaken, the creak of carts. A distant steamship horn, the cries of seagulls. An ordinary morning. An ordinary day, and yet something was wrong. Anxiety sat beneath his ribs, refusing to let go. Intuition, fear, or simply exhaustion from the past weeks. Thomas rose, washed his face with icy water, and dressed. Osborne's notebook he hid beneath the floorboard, next to a tin box of savings and a note for Nancy in case something went wrong. The note contained the coordinates of the cache, the names of the guilty. On that to take care of Alice, it felt strange to write such a letter, as if saying goodbye to life itself. At the dockyard, he arrived earlier than usual. It wasn't yet 6. The fog turned familiar shapes into ghostly silhouettes. Masts looked like the skeletons of giants. Cranes, like strange beasts lurking in the milky haze. Thomas walked toward the workshop, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Finch was already waiting at the entrance. He held a mug with something hot inside. Steam rose and vanished immediately into the fog. Didn't sleep? Finch asked instead of greeting. Barely. Me neither. Finch handed him the mug. Here, warm up. Tea with rum helps. Thomas took a sip. The hot liquid burned his throat, but pleasant warmth spread through his body. The rum was cheap, but strong. Just what you needed before diving into icy water. Ready? Finch asked. Yes. They entered the workshop and began preparing the gear. Familiar motions, honed by years of working together. Check the suit for tears. Inspect the helmet of Valsworks. Test the pomp. Thomas worked automatically, his hands steady, while his thoughts drifted far away. Today, he would find the main cache. Find it and commit it to memory, because underwater you cannot write. Then he and Finch would go to the police. Not to the corrupt dockyard bosses, but to real authorities, perhaps even to London, to the Admiralty itself. With Osborne's notebook and eyewitness testimony, they could no longer be ignored. By 7 in the morning, everything was ready. The assistants hadn't arrived. Finch said he had dismissed them to avoid attention. Reasonable. The fewer people who knew, the better. A small barge waited at the pier, a little boat Finch had acquired somewhere the day before. They loaded the equipment, the pump, the ropes, the gear, and pushed off. The fog swallowed the shore almost instantly. It felt as though they were sailing into nowhere, into emptiness, into a milky abyss. Eastern Mole, Finch said, rowing steadily. Venizto mano dead. He watched the water, black, opaque, hiding its secrets. How many truths lay at the bottom of this harbor? How many bodies? How many lost cargoes? How many broken hopes? We never know what's down there, he thought. We descend into darkness and hope for the best. The Eastern Mole emerged from the fog without warning, a grey stone mass covered in algae and shells. Finch steered the boat to the far edge, where the pilings of the old warehouse began. Here, he said, dropping anchor, depths about 4 fathoms. The warehouse should be right. Below us, double quotes Thomas began, putting on the gear. Finch helped, fastening straps, securing weights, checking connections. His hands moved confidently, habitually. 8 years of working together. They knew each other better than some husbands and wives. Tom, Finch said, when the helmet was already on. Be careful. If anything goes wrong, pull the line and surface. Don't play the hero. I won't. Their eyes met through the glass viewport. Thomas noticed something strange in his partner's gaze, anxiety, perhaps, or regret. But he had no time to think about it. Finch tightened the final bolt and tapped the helmet. Good luck. Dive. Cold wrapped around him from all sides, even through the suit. December water was ice cold, so cold that teeth began to chatter within minutes. Thomas descended slowly, watching the tension in the air hose. The world above ceased to exist. Down here, silence reigned, not complete, not dead, muted, as if the world had been covered with a thick blanket. Thomas heard his breathing, loud, echoing, inside the helmet, and a distant, rhythmic sound. Finch pumping the air above. The bottom appeared sooner than expected. Or perhaps time simply moved differently down here. Silty, strewn with debris and shells, it stretched in every direction, a dull grey plain. But ahead, even in the half-dark, Thomas saw it. Something was there, something large. He moved forward, sinking ankle-deep into the silt. With every step, the outlines grew clearer. And then he understood what he was seeing, a warehouse. A real underwater warehouse. Dozens of bundles, neatly stacked on wooden pallets, barrels, crates, coils of rope. Copper sheets stamped with the Admiralty seal, hundreds of sheets, maybe thousands. A fortune hidden on the harbor floor, in a place no one visited except divers. Thomas stood in the middle of this wealth, his heart pounding somewhere in his throat. Territoire. The proof, undeniable, tangible, proof that he had been right from the very beginning. He tugged the signal line twice, which meant all clear. Continuing the inspection, the line gave a small jerk in response. Finch had received the signal. Thomas began to move through the warehouse slowly, carefully memorizing the layout of the cargo. Copper here. Ropte. Several crates with tools stacked neatly in the corner. Everything was organized, everything placed with intention. This was not a random dump, but a real storage facility. Someone had taken this operation seriously. And then he noticed something subtle. The air, at first, he thought it was just his imagination. He took a deep breath. No, definitely weaker. Another breath. Weaker still. Asif Somon, somewhere above us closing the pump. Tas pulled the signal line 3 times. Emergency ascent. No response. He pulled again and again. The line floated in the water, lifeless, slack, abandoned. The air grew heavier, thicker. Each breath was harder than the last. Thomas felt panic rising, the same panic he had learned to control over 12 years of work, yet never truly erased. And then he understood. Finch. The realization struck him so violently that he nearly lost his balance. His thoughts began to spin, forming a terrible, unmistakable picture. Finch had always known where he was sent. Finch directed every dive. The western pier, the northern mole, the eastern warehouse. Finch was always nearby when Thomas discovered something suspicious. Finch had once saved him from a partially cut hose, a hose Finch himself had sliced, not all the way through. Just enough to make it look convincing. The initials in Osborne's notebook. W.F. Walter Finch. Finch had operated the pump for James Davis on the day Davis died. Officially, the hose had burst, but hoses do not burst on their own. Finch knew every step of Thomas's investigation. Thomas had told him everything, as a friend, as a partner, as the man to whom he entrusted his life. For 12 years, Thomas descended into the depths knowing that Finch was above him, holding the pump. 12 years. Every dive an act of absolute, unquestioning trust. And all that time, beside him, was a man who could have killed him at any moment. The air was almost gone now. Isead's peu. Darkness crept into his vision. Thomas knew he had only minutes left, perhaps less. No, he thought, not here. Not by his hand. He looked around and saw the pilings of the pier, old wooden posts. Thick, with barnacles, rising upward toward the surface, about 20 feet away. An eternity in heavy gear, without air, over a muddy bottom, but there was no choice. Thomas moved forward, sinking into the silt, stumbling over unseen debris. The lead-weighted boots dragged him down. The weights on his chest and back turned, every step into torture. His lungs burned, demanding air that did not exist. 10 feet. Black spots danced before his eyes. 15 feet. His legs trembled, ready to give out. 20, he grabbed a piling, his fingers closing around slick, water-worn wood. A chien, an old anchor, chain coiled around the post. Thomas clung to it and began to climb, link by link, foot by foot. His hands shook, his muscles refused to obey. But he kept climbing because the only alternative was death. And then, suddenly, the surface appeared. Thomas broke the surface, tore off his helmet, and for several minutes did nothing but breathe, gulping in the cold December air, alive. Ewa leave, and then expect. It was not Finch standing on the pier. It was a military patrol. For Royal Marines in red uniforms stood there. Strain bezit de Hashem noises Frey Superintendent Edward Radcliffe, Pool Himliff ordered. 2 soldiers came down to the water and helped Thomas climb onto the pier. He stood there, soaked, trembling, still unable to understand what was happening. Mr. Blackwood, Radcliffe said, stepping closer. I'm glad you're alive. How? Thomas managed. How are you here? I've been watching you. The superintendent allowed himself a faint smile. For several weeks now. Ever since you found Higgins. But you threatened me in your office. I warned you. Radcliffe shook his head. Those are different things. I've known about the smuggling for a long time, Mr. Blackwood, and I knew who was behind it. What I needed was evidence, and someone who could find it. Thomas stared at him, hardly believing what he was hearing. You used me. I gave you the chance to do what you wanted to do anyway, Radcliffe replied calmly, and I protected you as much as I could. When O'Brien started asking too many questions, I arranged his transfer. Not to silence him, but to save his life. There was a noise behind them. Thomas turned and saw 2 soldiers escorting Finch forward. His former partner's hands were tied behind his back. His face was pale, empty, lifeless. Their eyes met. Finch said nothing. He didn't resist. He didn't try to justify himself. He simply looked at Thomas, the man he had just tried to kill, the man he had worked with for 8 years. Why? Thomas heard his own voice as if from far away. Walter. Why? Finch was silent for a long time. Then spoke quietly, without. I have 6 children, Tom, 6, and a wife who's ill, and 3 pounds a week, barely enough to eat, and that's why you killed. Thomas asked. I didn't want to. Something broke in Finch's voice. Davis started suspecting. Higgins too. They told me that if I didn't get rid of them, they'd get rid of my family. Who told you? Osborne and others. Big men, Tom, the kind you don't argue with. Thomas stood there, looking at the man he had trusted more than himself. 12 years, every dive, every breath underwater. All of it had been possible only because Finch was above, working the pump. All this time. Take him away, Radcliffe ordered. They led Finch off. He didn't look back. Thomas remained, standing on the pier, watching the fog slowly lift. The sun broke through the clouds, weak, pale, winter sunlight, but sunlight all the same. The first light in many days. Christmas of 1867 was quiet and snowy. Thomas sat in his sister's living room by a brightly burning fireplace, watching Alice unwrap her presents, a new book, Great Expectations by Dickens, a silk scarf, and a small brooch with a blue stone, just like the one Mary used to wear. Daddy, it's beautiful. Alice pressed the brooch to her chest. Wear it in good health, sweetheart. He no longer worked as a diver. Radcliffe had offered him a position as a keeper at the port warehouse, warm, safe work with a decent wage. Thomas accepted without hesitation. He'd had enough of depth, cold, and trusting those who held the pump. Finch was tried in January. He was found guilty of 2 murders and sentenced to hanging. Osborne and 3 other officials were sent to penal servitude. The smuggling operation was fully exposed. Thousands of pounds of government property had passed through it. Thomas did not attend the trial. He didn't want to see the face of the man he once called a friend. That evening, after Alice had fallen asleep and Nancy and George had gone to the neighbors for a holiday dinner, Thomas stepped out onto the porch. Snow lay everywhere, clean, white, sparkling in the light of the Christmas lanterns. Mary had loved the snow. She used to say it made the world more honest. Maybe she was right. Snow hides dirt and ugliness, but it cannot hide the truth forever. Sooner or later, spring melts it away, and everything that was hidden comes to light. The same is true of people. You can pretend to be someone you are not, but one day the mask falls, and you see the real face beneath it. We never know who's holding our rope, Thomas thought, looking out at the snow-covered street. We never truly know whom we trust. It was a hard lesson. But he survived to learn it. And somewhere in the harbour of Spithead, beneath the dark water, the silty bottom continued to guard its secrets, old ones and new ones, and would keep guarding them for a long time yet, until another diver descended and found something he was never meant to find. But that would be another story.